All right. Well, we're back with our good friend and someone who is an original, what they call OG seed oil disrespecter, as the kids say these days. But that's not how Tucker framed it back then when he was out there in the wilderness battling against canola and rapeseed, and which is the same thing, but I like to hit both of them and both terms and soybean oil, and he was battling corn oil before it was cool. Tucker Goodrich, how you doing?
I'm doing well, and let's give credit where it's due. This seed oil disrespecter is my co-host on my blog or on my podcast. Often, he's a physician, Brian Curley, and he's way better than I could ever hope to be at getting this message out. So God bless, God bless us that he's
All you gotta
here.
do is open up Microsoft Paint and start making memes, Tucker.
I just don't have the inclination or the interest.
You
I
know,
made a
true.
meme once, and I think nobody paid
What
any
was the meme?
attention
Was
to
it
it,
a
even
was it
though
like a chart with a lot of complicated statistics?
no, it was four panels. One of them was Fauci, one of them was Hitler, one of them no, no, no. One of them was Fauci, one of them was Hitler, one of them was uh Jefferson Davis, and I forget who the fourth one was. And it was the death count in terms of how many Americans they'd each killed.
Wow.
And
Well,
I thought
Tucker,
that was pretty good, but
Tucker, you're supposed to be funny, Tucker. That's
see, there you go.
so. Anyways, you and I've done a lot of programs over the years on radio and podcasts, but there's a lot going on that we haven't talked about together yet, which is a couple things. And the general theme of this is like your what you'd like to see happen to the Make America Healthy Again initiative that Kennedy has proposed in a unity ticket with Trump. Although I heard Trump say the other day at the Al Smith dinner, he said, I don't know about Kennedy. I might let him go for a little bit, and then I'm going to have to rein him back in. So that sounded like he's already getting calls from the big ag and the big food and the big whatever saying, boy, you better rein that boy in. I got a lot of corn and Iowa to sell, and I don't want no problems. And he's probably saying, it's okay. We're going to let him do one little thing, and then we're going to push him back. But who knows? We'll see what happens with all that.
Well, look, I mean, and that sort of gets into the meat of why we're talking today is a lot of people have the impression that I'll call him Bobby Kennedy because that's how apparently he introduces himself to people. As it happens, my wife was at a party with him, and that's how he introduced himself to her years ago. Um, so a lot of people see him as pushing a lot of nonsense, okay? And I'm not, that has been my impression of him over the years. But when he started becoming a presidential candidate and started making some claims in some areas that I was familiar with, I went and did some fact checks on X to see is what he's saying accurate? The stuff that he says that sounds a little crazy, is it
Yeah.
accurate? And it was. And since I've been paying attention to him closely, for the most part, the stuff that he says that I'm familiar with, he's spot on. And he's often very, very careful about what he says and conducts himself in a very lawyerly way where, I mean, he's been a lawyer for most of his career and he spent a lot of time in court and litigation,
Yeah.
and he understands the value and the importance of making claims that can be verified and that people aren't going to turn around and say, well, this is BS because there's an old principle in law called falsus in uno, falsus in omnium, which means false in one thing, false in all things.
Yeah.
And it was the principle that if you caught a witness lying in a court case, that you could therefore instruct the jury, you could, discredit them on everything they said because they weren't trustworthy, right?
Yeah.
And in my experience, he seems to be really careful about doing that. I'm careful about doing that. I spent a lot of time on Wall Street in an environment where falsehoods could lead you to being taken out of the building in handcuffs, if not fired. And I got audited a lot of times. We had the government come into our office and go over my work and go over the things that I had said and done. And, I never once got dinged. So it's super important, especially when you're telling people something they don't believe and often don't want to hear, which is what Kennedy is doing. So, yeah, Kennedy, I think, is good. I think some of the stuff that he talks about is clearly problematic. I mean, I think organic food is nice, but they did a big uncontrolled trial down in Sri Lanka where they mandated getting rid of pesticides and having the whole country go organic, and it's been a total catastrophe because their food supply crashed by like 20% and the economy crashed and then the government crashed and they had mobs going through the presidential palace or whatever they call it. I mean, it was a total catastrophe. So when he says, okay, we need to make, if he says something like, okay, we need to make the food all organic, I'm going to be like, whoa, buddy, wait a minute. Ideally, is that a good idea? Yeah, but let's look at what happened in Sri Lanka and make sure that doesn't happen here.
He's also been talking about seed oils and how those are toxins,
Yes, that's right. And obviously, I agree with that. I don't know what his sources, how he's gotten that. I mean, I've spent a bunch of years trying to influence the influencers, trying to make this a serious topic, and it's a serious topic when you have a presidential candidate talking about it, and
Yeah, we
now,
didn't have
it's
that
become
kind of
part of the
support,
Trump
but
campaign.
we
I
didn't
mean,
have that kind of this thing has blown up really fast, we didn't when you and I were talking about this on radio just a few years ago,
yep,
it was a very exotic topic. Nobody was talking about it in any other talk radio show like I was doing or any, yeah, you guys had the seed oil stuff was going on in podcasts that were interested in alternative health views, but there
right,
was no talk of this in the culture. And now
right,
the leading presidential candidate, that's one of the biggest pivots of, one of the biggest kind of selling points of his campaign is this promise of make America healthy again with seed oils prominently featured in that.
right,
That's
right. And I mean, how did we do that? We went out with a message that was bulletproof, right? Everything that I said, I had scientific evidence to back it up. And when people went and fact checked me, they always found that I said what was verifiable by looking at the research. I remember pretty early on, I did a podcast. I can't remember who it was now, but one of the listeners went through and audited me. And he produced like, God, I've printed it out. It's like 7 or 8 pages of all the stuff that I talked about. And he went back and he figured out all the original sources. And, I got permission from him and I put it up on my blog. But, you know, people can do that. People can listen to what I say and they can go and find out, yes, I am accurately representing everything, that I have read in the science to convince people. We've been in the process of trying to put a debate together, and the problem we're having is that we can't find anybody to take the other side of the debate who's credible. Um, Nobody seems to want to stand up and go, okay, seed oils are good for you. Even, we're trying to reach out to some people who are affiliated with the American Heart Association and uh, see if they will come on and defend a paper that they just wrote. And well, I don't know, maybe they will, but they probably won't after they read my blog post about their paper, but which I
what do
haven't
you
released yet, but it'll come out
what
shortly.
would you like to see policy wise for Kennedy and Trump to implement if they could?
Well,
Just give me your top three things, a couple things that come to mind.
I mean, the first, ideally, right? So there's practically and there's ideally. Ideally, we would, at the very least, make major changes to the dietary guidelines. And the recommendation that people limit saturated fat and replace it with polyunsaturated and monounsaturated fats from seed oils should go out the window, right? That was based
If you
on,
change the dietary guidelines, would that legally bind up the standard of care in hospitals and stuff like that, the food they would do?
yes,
Yeah,
That's right.
that would be good. Yeah.
Right. Hospitals, schools, the military, a lot of these government programs are obligated to follow the dietary guidelines, right? And the dietary
Can that be done? That
guidelines,
can be done through executive action. That doesn't need to be legislative, right?
no, I believe it's legislative.
Well, that won't happen then.
Well, but it could
It
happen,
won't
right? I
happen.
mean,
Do you realize all the energy is with, Kennedy and then this Trump alliance with it, but there's nobody reflective of this in the House on the Republican side except for Thomas Massey. He's the only one that would go along with any of this stuff. All those other they're so bought out. They
yeah,
have
but
so
okay,
much.
fine, David. 3 years ago, would you have said that this was going to be a feature of the next
Yeah,
presidential
but
election?
never bet against the stupidity and the cowardice of a Republican elected official.
Right. But that's
Always
why,
lose.
that's why, okay, talking about, so ideally you change the dietary guidelines and
I think
then
he
that
could
would
do it
start
through
to
executive. I
cascade.
think he could do it through the executive. I think he'd have to clear house, fire like so many people. If he was the head of the Department of Health and Human Services, that would take care of a lot of these organizations.
Yeah, I don't know. I
Who
mean,
I don't
I
know
don't,
who is. Yeah, who maybe it's USDA. Would he have to be?
it's the USDA. The USDA is in charge of the
And then
dietary guidelines.
that's the problem with
And
him. If he would probably have to be, he'd have to be in a position where he's not appointed by the Congress because they won't let him get in. Like Mitch McConnell won't let him get in. He's totally owned by big soy, big corn, big.
right, but let's say that replace the leadership of the USDA and I don't know how much of the dietary guideline structure is defined legally. I know some of it is. But I mean, Congress has already come out and said they have to adopt that they're not scientific and they have to adopt a more rigorously scientific protocol. And they claim they've done that, but nothing has changed, right? None of their recommendations have changed. So yeah, theoretically, you could get a new uh, head of the USDA who'd come in and clean house and say, okay, we need to have something that's more representative of what the science actually says.
That problem with Kennedy
Um,
that he has just as much importance, if not more, in some ways, for the pharma side, which would be FDA and CDC and all that, kind of curtailing that nonsense over there would be good. So, I think
well,
he should take
there's
an advisory role where he can influence the staffing of all of those agencies, without having to pick one or the other.
Yeah, well, clearly, if we're going to change things in DC, there's going to have to be a lot of staff changes at the very least, or
Yeah. Oh
else.
my goodness, they're going to make that such a hysterical thing.
Yep,
They've
yep.
already primed these low IQ folks to believe that, this guy is going to be implementing a fascist dictatorship on day one. So all
Although,
it takes is
according,
one person losing their job at the FDA, walking out, and oh my gosh, this is a
yeah, no, I know, it's
crisis.
just
This is
ridiculous. It's
bigger than
like
9/11. Bob lost his
Biden the other
job.
day saying Trump says he's going to get rid of the Department of Education. Oh my God, that'll be the end of civilization as we know it. I mean, it's just so ridiculous. But, on the flip side, they keep saying all this stuff and Trump's going up in the polls pretty steadily. So, it doesn't seem to be working anymore.
Until it hits DC. We'll see. We'll see what they can actually get done.
Yeah.
Um, but so you like the idea of dietary guidelines? What's the second or third thing policy you'd like to see happen?
Well, I mean, ultimately, what's going to move the needle, what's more likely to move the needle is people changing their buying habits, right?
Mhm.
And I've been saying this all along, right? More and more we get people to change what they buy. The companies, at the end of the day, really only care about what they can sell.
Mhm.
And they're selling stuff with seed oils right now because we've been misled into thinking the science shows us that it's healthy. And when
But
people
isn't it as
start
such
coming,
that they're so subsidized though that they could take a loss for decades on the market with this
yeah, but
socialist
if people
government?
don't buy it, it doesn't matter what the subsidies are, right?
But they'll just subsidize them anyways, and they'll just keep pushing it in, right?
Yeah, but it's
It's kind of
like
like the media. Like the media,
no, no,
why
no,
does the
it's like
market doesn't get?
electric vehicles, right? there are true believers who buy electric vehicles because they think it's a good technology. And
Mhm.
then there are a lot of people who do it when they have because of the subsidies. And
Yeah.
as soon as they take the subsidies away, the market for electric vehicles collapses. We saw that when they did it in Europe, in the United States, uptake. So there's definitely a component there of subsidies making it. But if everybody realize the day, say everybody realizes that your electric vehicle is very likely to blow up in your house and burn your house down, nobody's going to buy them, and it's not going to matter what the
Yeah, I
subsidies
hope
are.
so. I'm just thinking of the resistance and some of the, like, for markets to change it. One of the things is, like, for example, people might wonder, well, how is it that CNN can have less viewers than, you know, obscure podcast, but yet, we can have a situation where they're still on the TV and they're still going. They've got millions of dollars. They've got influence over lots of people. Now let's take CNN, MSNBC, CBS, NBC. All these guys are getting advertisements from, pharmaceutical companies and Raytheon, which is a military industrial complex. So it's money laundering. They're
And
running money. Yeah,
companies like Unilever who are promoting seed oil
yeah. So they're
consumption.
running money in there with the
Right.
idea that I don't care if the advertisement's not going to do much for me. It's the purchase of the propaganda machine for my narrative's interest to keep psyoping the heck out of people into making this much harder to, have any kind of resistance or change. So, I'm concerned that, you know, just saying, well, let the market figure out. The market is so rigged for corporate fascists. Ironically, these guys like to talk about fascism. They are the
Right.
quintessential corporate fascists. Big government, big business married together in a kind of merger that you don't even know where it begins and ends. The differences. But
Well,
this alliance
that's you're
can run
right, and
on.
that's exactly how we got to where we are. But, in a way, during COVID, they did us a huge
Yeah,
favor by torpedoing their own credibility
yeah.
with all
But
these flagrant, obvious lies that
yeah.
we were all supposed to believe.
With an alliance, it's hard to imagine, like, how much the market could, uh, you know, um, weed this evil stuff out without
Well,
some government repeal of some
look
sort of
at
stuff.
look at cigarettes.
Yeah,
Right? The demonstration that cigarettes were bad for people caused a consistent and sharp decline in cigarette consumption,
but this is
even though
different.
they
This
were
is food.
subsidized,
This is
even though they
food.
were subsidized, which predated all of the government's. It was only when it was obvious that people were smoking less and less and less that the government came out with increased taxes and prohibition of cigarettes and all of this other stuff, right? The market the market informed by good science drove that dynamic where smoking is now, a lot of people still smoke, but it's not considered to be normal the way it once was. I mean, it used, c- cigarettes, I mean, they don't even put ashtrays in cars anymore. And the idea of smoking on an airplane is like, I mean, if you did that, they'd throw you out the window. And it used to be normal.
Yeah, but yeah, that's so you think that same thing's going to happen just even without any government reform or repeal of certain things?
I think that's what's driving the government reform,
Well,
right?
sure. Yeah, yeah.
Right. And that's why, even if, say,
You're on the
Trump
deep
doesn't
state's
win this
naughty list, then,
election,
aren't you? My goodness.
huh?
You're going to be on the deep state's naughty list if you keep that up. They're going to find out who these. You're like the like a Karl Marx of this uprising from the peasants or something.
Well, I
You're
prefer to think
scheming.
of myself as an Adam Smith.
Yeah, Adams, you're
Um,
scheming in the shadows of your lair there. Going,
yeah, now that is a concern,
you better
honestly.
be careful on those ski trips you're doing in the mountains so he doesn't push you over.
Um, that's that's definitely a concern. There's actually somebody put up a Wikipedia page called Seed Oil Misinformation. And I was told, I don't know if it's still there, I was told it was supposed to be uh, yanked because it was too biased. But, yeah, they're trying to paint this with the same brush.
Mhm.
And but it's, they're kind of late to the game. And unfortunately, people, I mean, it's hilarious. It was when I started doing this on Twitter. I was making all of these claims, and I knew I was starting to have an impact when people I had never interacted with started coming back to me with things that I had talked about. Did you know? Like, oh, yeah, I knew that. That's why you know it, is because I've been talking about this.
Mhm.
So it's, I mean, the internet, the original idealistic concept of the internet was the internet interprets censorship as an outage in routes around us.
Yeah.
And that's true. And that's why the mainstream media is getting into more and more troubles, because back in the Walter Cronkite era, there was no alternative source for information, but now there are lots of them.
Mhm.
And that's why these governments are trying to suppress free speech on the internet, because they recognize that it's very effective to go do the sort of thing that I'm doing and that other people have done in other areas, and demonstrate that they're lying. And it's pretty easy once you see the alternative data, you're like, oh, these people are lying to us. And that's why the EU and the Biden administration have been trying to shut down free speech on the internet, because they've got their little stories that they try and tell, and they don't want anybody to be able to say, no, you're baloney.
I saw some people online that were showing that they're switching horse feed, adding coconut oil instead of some of these toxic amounts of grains and stuff, and they're finding the horses are doing a lot better for coconut
See,
oil.
see, now this is a perfect example of what I was just talking about. Yes, that was a blog post that I put out.
That was you? So
And
are you on it's an equine? Let me show you the website. Let me see. Or maybe you're saying you're popularized it or something, right? Let me see.
yeah, I did. I originally did a post about that in 2012, and I just put it out on my Substack again with some updates on it.
Let's see.
And yeah, I mean, yeah, that's amazing. Even horses benefit from going on from reducing their omega-6 and increasing their omega-3. And coconut oil, as we've discussed, is very low in omega-6, so it's beneficial for horses.
And then I saw somebody else. She said that online. She was saying that they finish their grass fed cows with coconut oil instead
That's
as their finish,
that's
and it is that yours too?
no, I haven't heard that. I haven't heard that, but that's an interesting thing. I don't know what to
And
think about that.
they said the meat is that like the fat is like buttery when you cut the fat. It's totally different from the grass fed or
Well, typically they grain finish, and then the cows
that's what I'm
make
saying. This one they do like she said. I think it was alfalfa, blackstrap molasses, and coconut oil instead of the. If you want, they have options. I guess they
on how
raise it
fatty you want your meat to be.
and they put coconut oil and blackstrap molasses and some. I think alfalfa or something, and instead of the grain finish.
Interesting.
And
No,
it
I haven't
comes
heard
out
that
totally
aspect of it.
different and amazing. And the cows are much more robust and vital.
Yeah,
Humans
well,
need
grain finishing cows is a problem. I mean, the reason the meat, if you compare grain finished meat to grass-fed meat, it's bright red because they're inflamed,
wow,
right?
yeah,
It's unhealthy. And if you give it too much grain to them, you kill them.
yeah,
So you have to be very careful when you're grain finishing cattle that you're not making the cattle too sick,
yeah,
because you're causing them to become obese and inflamed, right? That's according to the USDA,
yeah,
that is prime grade meat, is meat from sick cows. Eat up,
yeah.
yum yum.
Well, with all this rising discourse where Kennedy's talking about seed oils and Trump's engaging the idea on a superficial level, um, a lot of people, were hoping that he would have challenged the beef tallow absence at the McDonald's fries that he was serving the other day. Um,
Yeah,
but nevertheless, it's become a much more big deal in mainstream. So another one that's been rising at the same time has been a voice, Calley Means and Casey Means. There's a brother and sister duo,
right.
uh, doctors, both of them, I believe.
No,
Uh,
Casey, the sister, is a doctor trained at Stanford, and he's an entrepreneur, I understand, and they have a
okay,
couple of health related businesses that they've
okay,
started up over the last few years, including one called Levels, which I'm not really familiar with,
yeah.
but I've heard about.
And they have a new book out, I think called Good Energy. And I'm going to try to see if I can have them on the show and talk to them. But
Yeah, I haven't read the book.
I saw they really took off big when they went on Tucker Carlson's show, and I'd never heard of them before that. And I don't know, maybe they've been doing it for years. There's a lot of folks doing stuff. The internet's big, and but they really just came out of nowhere, seemingly, with the Tucker Carlson appearance. That Bobby Kennedy, really promoted that himself,
Right.
and Bobby was really moved by that and his viral appearance on Tucker. And then Bobby has mentioned them many times in other shows. And apparently they were working with Bobby Kennedy, and then they switched over to Trump, and then Kennedy aligned with Trump, and they've also they've recently gone on Rogan's show, so they kind of hit the two biggest podcasts right now in terms of talking about topics like seed oils or whatever, and they've been pushing a really strong narrative, dovetailing um, with Kennedy's initiatives that kind of provides some ammo for what's wrong with our body. And they're getting a lot of the great stuff right in the big broad picture. They're talking about it's all about metabolism. That's so
Right.
good. And it's all about mitochondrial health. And it's all about looking at kind of diseases as one kind of, well, I don't know if they're using this terminology, but I've been looking into the stress mechanism theory. Hans Selye and other folks have built on the idea that chronic diseases are mostly manifested from one mechanism in the body, and this kind of holistic picture of all these disparate diseases being tied together as one giant metabolic dysfunction pathway that's breaking down in different particularities. But they've
Which, of course, is something we've been talking about for
yeah,
years.
yeah, we have, and that's fine. But my point is there was a recent clip they did with Rogan, and I asked you, what do you think of it? Because Calley Means mentioned the Flexner Report, which I have heard for many years in the alternative health world has always been a kind of founding mythology of what's wrong with our big pharma and big food controlled system today. Flexner Report has all, I don't know if you've ever heard it, but I've heard it
I've
wide.
I have heard of it.
Yeah.
I've done a little bit of peripheral reading
Yeah.
about it. I did a
And I
lot
say
more after you
mythology
pointed me
not
at
in a
this thing.
disparaging term. I mean it in the sense of it's got this founding mojo energy to what went wrong.
Right.
And
Yep.
so I asked you what you thought of that and his claims, and he made a lot of different claims, but you put a post together on your Substack, tuckergoodrich.substack.com, right? And so
Yep.
give us your overall response to what you saw from Calley Means and what he was talking about first.
It, folks are upset that I did this post. In a nutshell, because okay, in a nutshell, it's baloney. And that isn't the word that I used on X to describe it, but it's what I'm going to call it here. And I went through point by point what he was saying. He was saying Flexner, he said that start at the top. He said the study came out in 1909, it came out in 1910, which is right on the cover page of it. So I'm guessing he's never actually looked at it. And then he said that Flexner was uh, John D. Rockefeller's personal attorney. Not true. As far as I can tell, Rockefeller had nothing to do with the production of this report. It was commissioned by the Carnegie Foundation. Flexner was not an attorney. He was an educator, a reformer, education reformer. And for whatever reason, the Carnegie Foundation, the teaching foundation, commissioned him to do this report. And it was a report about medical education in the United States, right? That's why it came out of it from a teaching perspective. And they talked about, okay, so Rockefeller didn't have anything to do with it. There's a lot of conspiracy theories out there that John D. Rockefeller is at the root of all evil. I think that's ridiculous. Rockefeller was a Christian. He was a very successful and, by all accounts, honest businessman, despite the propaganda that you hear about the robber barons. All the guys he did business with said they were treated fairly by him. And, he, became the wealthiest man in the world, arguably the wealthiest man the world's ever seen. If you look at how much of the wealth of the United States he owned when he was alive, it's actually mind-boggling. Um, so yeah, that part of it's baloney. Um, Big problem. And then he starts talking about, and it literally says in the binding guidelines that holistic health and nutrition, this is Calley Means summarizing this report. And it literally says in the binding guidelines that holistic health and nutrition and anything about interconnectedness of the body is pseudoscience. Well, there are no binding guidelines in the document. It's available online. You can go read them like I did. Um, it doesn't say anything about holistic health and nutrition. Flexner goes out of his way to say that the role of the doctor is changing from just treating people's diseases to guiding people towards good health. And that in order for them to be successful at that, they need to be better educated. They need to be educated in scientific medicine, right?
Did you read the
So
Flexner
essentially,
report?
go ahead.
Did you read the Flexner report?
I didn't read the whole thing. It's 300 odd pages.
Mhm.
But I went through some of the relevant sections. Flexner does have a section called medical sex, SECTC, right? Different schools of medicine. There's what the complementary medicine people like to call allopathy, where you're simply treating symptoms but not the root cause of the disease, homeopathy, osteopathy, and a couple others I hadn't really heard of that don't seem to be a big thing anymore. Um, and he talks about the problems with these different areas of medicine and how that's reflected in their educational institutions, right? If you want to be a homeopath, which is quackery, okay? Let's just get that out of the way. Sorry, homeopaths. Homeopathy is quackery. And he goes through the poor condition of a lot of the schools that teach it and why they're trying to be more scientific. So essentially, the Flexner Report was an attempt to put medicine on a scientific footing, which is what I've been saying for years. So when
Mhm.
I went through and looked at this, I was like, okay, well, this is great. I mean, the biggest criticism I was able to find in researching it was that medical schools have somewhat gone away from the Flexner Report since the 1960s. And a lot of complementary medicine that doesn't really have a scientific basis is starting to be taught in medical schools again. And it shouldn't be. Medicine should be science, right?
Yeah.
And that's the whole problem with people in the FDA and the pharma business is that they're perjuring themselves when they claim to be scientific, and they are not following the scientific method to confirm that things like the COVID vaccine are actually safe and effective. That's the problem that we have in medicine. So the Flexner report is great, as far as I can tell.
I've
And
heard that.
even
I've
I
I've
found a
heard
paper. Sorry,
I've heard negative things about it from. Have you read the book The Body Electric, about the electromagnetic properties in the body by Robert Becker, who was studying this?
I have not.
So, he criticizes the Flexner report, and a lot of folks who are great thinkers have kind of situated it as maybe it's been overplayed, the conspiratorial elements. I'm not sure. I'd have to look into it further myself on that, but that it was kind of part of the spirit of the age, that it was put into motion, in which medicine was being captured by kind of a genetics kind of gene. It's going in the direction of what would become a genetics focused approach to medicine, primarily because it would be captured by the kind of mechanistic view of the body that was very popular in science at that time, which did kind of pushed aside the idea of there being a life force, what we would call in the theological terms spirit, soul, and all that. That's kind of this unifying principle of the body
Well,
that totally gets separated into this biochemical only focus on what medicine is about, which drives out competitive paradigms like bioelectric medical interventions, which are still to this day considered on the peripheral of anything considered respectable medicine. So FDA and everything has been shaped around biochemistry as the foundational paradigm by which we view health, and also this kind of mechanistic disparate parts, model of the human person, which has done us so poorly.
Well, I don't know about that. I mean, I will observe that, you know, if they think you have problems with your heart, they give you an EKG, which is an electrocardiogram, and they're looking at the bioelectrical fields in your heart. If you have brain problems, they're going to give you an EEG, an electroencephalograph, and that's looking at, so medicine has definitely taken up a lot of that thought. As far as treatments go, I mean, I've heard some stuff about like helping bones heal using electromagnetic fields and stuff like that.
Well, that's my
So that
point.
may,
It's
but
so
wait,
peripheral.
wait, wait, wait. So there is actually a conspiracy, right, that we should discuss. And I just read a book called The Foundations by Renee Wormser, who was a Senate staffer in the 1950s. And they looked at all of these big foundations, like the Carnegie Foundation that was behind the Flexner Report, and the Rockefeller Foundation and the Ford Foundation. And they found that they were, in fact, conspiring, for instance, against religious schools, and they affected funding to religious schools based on how much they would give up their religious instruction. So there was definitely a conspiracy coming along, and a lot of it was from this progressive mindset that often verged into pseudoscience, right? So we have, eugenics, which
Yeah.
is a whole huge part of
Yeah.
the progressive idea of medicine and science
Yeah.
and how we're going to make the United States a better part, right? And that was kind of, so the Flexner Report, as far as I can tell, doesn't get into any of that stuff. And I mean, so
Was
I
it
found this
used?
paper.
Was it used though as a tool though to help advance that agenda at the end of the day? That's the question, I guess.
I mean, he was really mostly concerned with getting rid of poor quality education.
Mhm.
Right. The whole thing was just how do you get, and there was a lot of quackery going on back then in medicine, right? I mean, so
Mhm.
I found a paper, titled The Flexner Report of 1910 and its impact on complementary and alternative medicine and psychiatry in North America in the 20th century. Okay. And here's what he says about the Flexner Report. In general, the report triggered a much needed reform in the standards, organization, and curriculum of North American medical schools, and also resulted in a strong emphasis on formal analytic reasoning and positivism in medical science. That's all good stuff, right? Part of the Flexner Report was something that we can object to. Most people probably aren't aware of this, but American physicians are the highest paid physicians in the world. And that's because they operate like a guild with federal assistance. So they limit the number of doctors who are produced each year. They limit the number of hospitals, which keeps doctors' fees and hospital rates high, right? That's a conspiracy that's been going on and was kicked off in the Flexner Report.
But that's the part of the
Now,
problem with why how bad medicine is today.
well, yeah, but the way to make medicine better isn't by eliminating standards in medical education and basically making it so easy to become a doctor that anybody can go out an MD and become an MD in a couple of years, right? I mean, nobody wants to go see a doctor who doesn't know what he's talking about and
That's
doesn't have
everybody in
any
our
good
system
training.
today, though.
Beg your
That's
pardon?
everybody in our system today.
No, 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 no. If you read what Flexner is talking about, it's appalling what was going on back then.
But would you
I mean,
rather
it
would you
was
rather live in the
horrific.
would you rather live in the world that Flexner inherited or the world that after came after the Flexner report medically? I think
As far as medicine alone goes,
yeah.
absolutely afterward, no question. Now, is there a lot of stuff that we can
You'd
still
rather
fix in
live
medicine?
afterwards, you're saying?
Yeah, absolutely afterwards. Absolutely afterwards. I mean, you go back in the history of medicine and all these things, all these unscientific practices that everybody laughs about now, like, bleeding people and, all of this stuff that was pretty effective at killing patients. A lot of that stuff went away because it didn't have a scientific basis. And after Flexner, by the way, Flexner did wind up he worked for one of the Rockefeller foundations and got $50 million in funding to implement his report from Rockefeller years after it had been published. As far as I can tell, Rockefeller had no impact whatsoever in the actual report. But Rockefeller was the first person in the world to systematically eliminate a disease, and this was hookworm in the United States, right? And he funded a guy who said, look, hookworm is a hygiene problem. We can go through the southern United States and teach people how to make outhouses and blah, 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 and we can get rid of hookworm, which had a major negative impact on people in the southern United States. And that was like the first triumph of public health, right?
Mhm.
Was eliminating hookworm infestation to the point now where it's virtually unheard of in the United
Mhm.
States, right?
Mhm.
So Rockefeller did a lot of good stuff, and he was behind a lot of making medicine more rigorous and more scientific. And I mean, the problems, as I was saying, the problems with medicine today are the areas where it's not rigorous and it's not scientific, right?
Yeah, but creating that guild and that government created guild and cartel system is what produced the deep capture of medicine for, profiteering and
I
awareness.
wouldn't say, I mean, medicine, that's always been an aspect of medicine long before the Flexner Report came out. I mean, if you look at the history of vaccination, for instance, doctors like to take credit for vaccination, but it was actually around long before doctors accepted it as a treatment. And for a long period of time, non-physicians had been trying to get physicians to pay attention to practices like variolation to prevent smallpox. In fact, the crucial proof of this possibility of vaccination was conducted by Cotton Mather, who was a minister in Boston who had heard of variolation and worked with the local doctor guild came out against it, right? And Mather worked with this one doctor to treat people with variolation. We won't get into what that is, but it's like a primitive form of vaccination. And he kept records on it, right? And it was the records that he kept, the scientific statistical record keeping, that was able to prove to the medical guilds that this was something that could actually work and something they should take seriously. So that mindset has long predates the Flexner Report, right? That unwillingness to approach things in a scientific manner and other things like scurvy and vitamin C. I mean, it took medicine
But
a
again,
couple
what I'm
hundred
trying to say
years to.
is that, like you said, that progressive eugenicist movement that was around the time and ascendant alongside the Flexner Report was the ideology that contributed to further centralization of medicine and food determination of quality and all of that, vaccines, with the centralization of all of the economy towards a corporate fascist command and control centralized economy, really
Right.
starts taking ascendant around the time that the Flexner Report comes around. So
Well,
all I'm
and
saying
the
is,
Flexner Report was without a doubt. I mean, a lot of the reforms that were made to the professions, right, like the law and
yeah,
medicine, were done by the progressive movement, and the rationale for doing it was to increase the quality of the profession. And in some cases, like in medicine, they definitely did do that. In other cases, like in the law, you could argue that what the ultimate point of reforming
mhm,
legal education and mandating that most lawyers have to go through law schools is that they've established a ideological conformity on an entire profession,
yeah,
right?
positivism.
Yeah, progressivism, right? I
Yeah.
mean, they switched the American Bar Association from a conservative organization to a progressive organization,
Mhm.
lockstep progressive nowadays. And, the same thing has happened to the AMA. And unfortunately, when these organizations start thinking that way, especially in like medicine, and they're thinking in lockstep, then they're not scientific
Yeah.
anymore, right? I mean, and for medicine especially,
Medicine's a joke, and this report help centralize that joke worse than ever
but
before.
but medicine is a joke nowadays because it's gone away from what the Flexner Report was trying to do, which
Well,
was
maybe
make
what that,
medicine
maybe what
rigorous
the,
and scientific.
maybe what it was advertising itself as, but whatever it was, I don't know. I have to do this. Your debate on this with Calley's points has made me want to go back and look at the source materials and do a further
Yeah. So
deep
then,
dive, which I
another
always like.
thing
See,
that,
I'm a nuanced person about this stuff. I don't
right.
mind. I've always thought Flexner was a villain, but when I heard your thing, I said, "Oh, that's interesting. Let's hear the other side." And I don't have, and I never got into. I don't just buy into the whole sensational conspiracy that's attached around them. But sometimes things can be overblown, but still problematic and still a part of the problem that led to where we're at today. I mean, you go to a
Yeah.
doctor today and you said that they are mechanistic by nature. Their whole philosophy is mechanistic.
And it has to be.
Yeah. I mean,
It has to
I had a
be.
doctor, he kept trying to push the COVID vaccine. He's dead now, but he
Yeah.
didn't need to
Well,
die. And it's sad, you know what I mean? And it's like, I wonder what contributed to that. He was a healthy, older. He wasn't that old, and wasn't that unhealthy looking, But
but I mean, and that's, it's sort of like one of the problems that we have in medicine is that they turned over dietary recommendations to a cult, the Seventh-day Adventists,
you and
who
those
founded
seven,
the dietitians, right?
yeah,
The profession of dietitian and much of the profession of nutrition science
yeah.
is an offshoot of a cult that thinks that if you eat a vegetarian diet, you're going to go to
But
heaven. Well,
there's a
that's
bigger cult
lovely.
at play, and that's the cult of
Huh?
statism. The cult of statism, the cult of progressive positivism. All of those things are something that are
Well, no, these
deeper than.
people, I mean, we could get into, yes, I would agree progressivism meets the definition of a cult, but this is a distinct
Even
cult.
the state is a cult. The state itself is a cult. The faith and trust in the state is a cult because, I mean, this is the problem we have today. People put their faith and trust in an institution that I don't think warrants that level of faith and trust. And
Right. And
yeah,
that's, so the problem I have with what Calley Means was saying on Rogan is that he's promoting and stoking conspiracy theories, right? John Rockefeller was not the devil. John Rockefeller was, by all accounts, a good Christian
yeah.
and put the largest fortune in the history of the world to work trying to make America a better place for everybody.
But
Now,
that could be
there are
true at the same
problems
time
with
that
how he did it,
yeah, but that could be true at the same time that the Flexner report is not so good, right? Because
but the Flexner Report is good, right? I mean, if you really want to understand what went wrong with and maybe we could do another podcast about this, we could talk about Wormser's book, The Foundations, which was the result of an extensive congressional inquiry into what was going on with the foundations. And it was ideological capture. They were basically taken over by people like my grandfather, who was a movement communist and a Stalinist, and wound up running one of these foundations that promoted the United Nations. Nope. So, hey. Okay. So, my summary, look, I'm happy to have the Meanses as allies. I think that we all need to be really careful in the arguments that we make, right? And we need to stick to solid arguments where we're not going to have people come back and point to this one thing that he says, one of his concluding comments was, um, John D. Rockefeller is the father of the pharmaceutical industry and created pharmaceuticals from byproducts of oil production and was the first investor into Johns Hopkins and other medical schools. I mean, none of that's correct. It's just we've got a good enough story where we don't need to make stuff up, right? We've got a great story. And it's gets to the means part. Sorry, pun there. It gets to the ends that the Means and I would both agree on, I think, and that RFK Jr. agrees on, and that most Americans agree on. I mean, make America healthy again. Who on earth is going to argue against that? But I think we have to be careful in the way that we do it, and we have to do it in a way that when people hear it, they're not going to immediately just throw the baby out with the bathwater just because they hear some stuff that is obviously not correct at the beginning of the argument.
I appreciate your time and I thank you for coming on and given us some good perspective and pushback on what is a very common trope amongst the alternative medicine world and anti-establishment health world. So it's something that requires further thought and investigation about, what went wrong and how and when and what for. So
Yeah, and I mean, you can understand why the alternative medical world, which in my view has good parts and bad parts, would be stinging from this because the Flexner Report put most of the medical schools, the alternative medical schools, out of business, right? And that was the design of it. So, yes, they would be upset about it. And I can see why they are taught by their instructors that it was a bad thing because if you were a homeopath or something like that, yeah, it probably was a really bad thing for your profession, but that doesn't mean that's bad for the country.
competition is a sin.
Competition is great, but
Who said that?
fraud is
Who's,
not good.
who said competition is a sin?
I don't know who.
Rockefeller.
Did he?
Yeah.
I'm gonna have to check that.
TuckerGoodrich.substack.com is the place you can go to find Tucker's blogs and posts. It's a lot easier to say than your past website, so I'm glad you got
I knew you'd
that right
enjoy
there.
it.
And your podcast is called
Debugging Life, but the easiest way to find it is just look under Tucker Goodrich on YouTube or follow my blog and I post all the episodes there.
Debugging Life. Isn't that your cooking show where you show people how to saute roaches and bugs and make them tasty?
No, it's not an exterminator show.
Okay.
It's from like a computer science perspective, right? Figuring out what's causing problems.
Yeah. All right. Take care, Tucker. Thank you.
Thank you, David.
Good to see you again.
Likewise.
And if you want to contact us, hello at theneighborschoice.com. I'm David Gornoski. Godspeed.